I used to think I had a pretty solid life, nothing fancy, but a life I could rely on. For 12 years, I was married to Sarah. She was everything I could have wanted. Kind, dependable, and the sort of wife who'd text me at random, saying, "I miss you," or "I hope you're having a great day." We had a comfortable home, stable jobs, and a rhythm that suited us. She'd pack me lunch if I was running late and made sure I was looked after. I always thought I was one of the lucky ones. But that illusion shattered about a month ago, on a night I'll never forget. We were having a regular Wednesday dinner, the kind we'd had hundreds of times before. Sarah had made spaghetti, and we were talking about the usual: work, weekend plans, the latest show we were watching. And then, without any warning, she looked up at me, calm as could be, and said, "Do you think we should try an open marriage?" I nearly choked. The shock was like an ice-cold wave slamming into me. I tried to laugh it off at first, thinking she was kidding, but there was no hint of humor in her face. Sarah was dead serious. "What?" I finally managed, my heart pounding. I couldn't have heard that right, could I? She sighed, looking down at her plate, twirling a piece of spaghetti around her fork as if she were just suggesting we rearrange the living room. Some couples do it. They love each other, but they see other people too. It's just something I've been wondering about. The ground beneath me seemed to shift. This was my wife, my Sarah, who couldn't keep a birthday surprise secret. I thought I knew her better than anyone. And now, out of the blue, she's suggesting this? I pushed my plate away, suddenly nauseous. "Sarah, is this really something you want?" I could barely keep my voice steady, even though my mind was reeling, trying to piece together what could have led to this. She shrugged, still not meeting my eyes. "I don't know. I've just been thinking about it. That's all." I sat there, numb, watching her fiddle with her food like this was just another casual dinner topic. But inside, a dark feeling began to take root. Something told me this wasn't as innocent as she was making it sound. I could hardly sleep that night. While Sarah drifted off beside me, I lay there wide awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over in my head. What was she really trying to say? We'd been together for over a decade. We were each other's best friends, right? I kept asking myself if I'd missed something, some sign that she was unhappy or unfulfilled. I'd never seen it coming. The next day, I tried to act normal. It wasn't easy. Every time I looked at her, I felt like there was a stranger in the house. Sarah went about her day as if nothing had happened, like she hadn't just dropped a bombshell that left me questioning our whole marriage. It was unsettling. Was this all just an innocent curiosity, or was there something more? I found myself obsessing over it. Over the next few days, I watched her closely, noticing things I'd usually ignore. Her phone was always within reach, like an extension of her hand, even when we were watching TV or having dinner. I started hearing those late-night message alerts more frequently. Every time I asked her who it was, she'd wave it off. "Just Kayla," she'd say, referring to her friend who'd always been a bit unpredictable. But doubt started creeping in, and that doubt had a voice, whispering that something was definitely wrong. And so, I did something I'd never done before. I started paying attention to her phone activity, her messages, even her behavior with her friends. It wasn't like I'd caught her lying, but it was this growing feeling that she was hiding something. I just had no idea how deep it would go. Then, one evening after she went to bed early, claiming she had a headache, I found myself in the kitchen, staring at her phone on the counter. It was locked, of course, but I knew her passcode. My hand shook as I picked it up, hesitating. Was I really going to cross this line? But my gut told me I had to know. I unlocked her phone, my pulse pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Part of me hoped I'd find nothing, that this was all just some crazy idea Sarah had picked up and nothing more. I opened her messages first. There was the usual back and forth with her friends, family, and work contacts. Nothing suspicious. I almost felt silly. Maybe this was all in my head. But then, something odd caught my eye. She had a string of messages with Kayla that seemed to have gaps. The conversation looked fragmented, like pieces were missing. I scrolled back, thinking maybe it was a glitch, but the more I looked, the clearer it became that Sarah had been deleting parts of their chats. My heart sank. What could she have been hiding? I backed out of the texts, my hand hovering over the other apps. I was about to put her phone down and let it go when I noticed her browser history. She cleared it recently. That wasn't something she normally did. Sarah was tech-savvy enough to browse casually, but clearing history was out of character. It was as if she wanted to make sure I wouldn't stumble across something. My suspicion grew into a gnawing certainty. Setting her phone back down, I felt a wave of shame wash over me. I'd never been one to snoop, never thought I'd end up the kind of guy to dig through my wife's things. But this wasn't some casual insecurity. I was genuinely worried that something was very wrong. The following night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, and decided I couldn't just let it sit. I had to talk to her. So, as we lay there in the dark, I asked, "Sarah, that conversation we had about an open marriage, have you been thinking about it for a long time?" She shifted beside me, not answering right away. "Not really," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It was just something I wanted to discuss. I know it might have seemed out of nowhere, but I thought maybe it was worth exploring." "But why?" I asked, feeling the frustration building up in my chest. "We've been good together. If something's missing, why didn't you just talk to me?" Sarah let out a long sigh, her voice wavering a little. "Jack, it's not that something's missing. I love you. I just thought, maybe we could try something different." Something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she was trying to convince herself just as much as me. I let it drop, not wanting to push any further. But that conversation only added fuel to the fire. If she wasn't unhappy, why bring this up? Why suggest something that could shatter what we had? The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was keeping something from me. So I started doing some detective work of my own. I knew Kayla had a reputation for pushing boundaries, for experimenting. She was wild, free-spirited, the type who always seemed to get Sarah into something spontaneous. Maybe she'd been encouraging Sarah to go down this path. I decided to casually bring it up with her over dinner. "So, you've been hanging out with Kayla a lot lately," I said, trying to sound as casual as possible. Sarah nodded, a little too quickly. "Yeah, she's been going through some things, so I've been around to help out. You know how she is, always getting into one mess or another." Her tone was light, but something in her eyes didn't match. I could tell she was trying to brush it off, but I wasn't buying it. The way she looked down at her plate, avoiding my gaze, told me there was more to this story. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of everything Sarah did. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she left the room to take a call, I couldn't help but wonder who she was talking to and what they were saying. I hated feeling like this, like I'd turned into some paranoid detective in my own marriage, but I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. I had to know. The final straw came a few nights later. Sarah was getting ready to go out for what she called a girls' night with Kayla. She was fussing over her appearance more than usual, trying on different outfits, applying makeup carefully, styling her hair just right. It struck me as odd. Sarah wasn't usually the type to dress up for a casual night out with her friend. As she stood in front of the mirror, putting on her lipstick, I asked, "Where are you guys going tonight?" "Oh, just a bar downtown," she replied without looking at me. "Nothing fancy. We'll probably be home late, so don't wait up." A knot formed in my stomach. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the way she was acting told me she wasn't being entirely honest. "Do you want me to pick you up if you have too much to drink?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She smiled, a quick, almost dismissive smile. "No, do not worry about it. We'll grab an Uber if we need one." That response sealed it for me. I told myself I was overthinking, that this was just a regular night out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After she left, I paced around the house, my mind racing. I thought about calling her, just to check in, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to come across as the jealous husband glued to his phone, imagining the worst. But then, as the hours ticked by, the worry turned into something sharper, more painful. It was nearing midnight when I finally broke down and texted her, "How's your night going?" The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, after about 40 minutes, she responded, "Sorry, just busy having fun. Love you." The message felt hollow, forced. I wanted to believe it was genuine, but the delay and the vague response gnawed at me. Something was definitely off. Unable to sleep, I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, waiting. When Sarah finally got home around 3 in the morning, she was quiet, slipping inside without a word. She headed straight to the bedroom, claiming she was tired. I watched her go, feeling that growing pit in my stomach. She'd never been that distant, never been so disconnected from me. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided that if she wasn't going to tell me what was going on, I would find out for myself. I thought back to the messages, the missing parts of her conversations with Kayla, the way she cleared her browser history. I realized I had a choice. I could confront her now, with what little I had, or I could dig deeper, find out exactly what was going on. As much as it hurt to think about, I knew what I had to do. I was going to get to the bottom of this. That night, after Sarah fell asleep, I went back to her laptop, feeling the same dread and guilt I'd felt before. I knew I was crossing another line, but I told myself it was necessary. I had to know if my suspicions were true, or if I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. Her laptop was unlocked, and I quickly navigated to her email, scrolling through messages that were mostly work-related. Nothing unusual there. Then I checked her browser history again, and this time, I found something. There was a private browsing window left open. My heart started pounding as I clicked on it, my hands trembling. The first few searches were innocent enough: online shopping, recipes. But as I scrolled down, my stomach twisted. She had been looking at articles and online forums about open marriages, and there were posts from months ago, well before she brought up the idea to me. She had left a few comments under a username that I recognized as hers. In her posts, she had asked for advice on how to approach the subject with a traditional partner, wondering how to get her husband on board. I sat back, stunned, my mind racing. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thought she brought up casually. She had been planning this, researching it for months, and I was supposed to believe it was just a thought she had? A dark, sinking feeling filled me. I couldn't deny it any longer. This was more than curiosity. She wanted this badly enough to seek advice from strangers on how to make it happen. But why? And, more importantly, who was encouraging her? That was when I remembered the gaps in her text conversation with Kayla. I'd known Kayla was unpredictable, but could she really be the one pushing Sarah into this? And if she was, how involved was she? Over the next few days, I became even more vigilant, watching for any small clue. Every time Sarah picked up her phone or excused herself from the room, I felt a mix of anger and betrayal. It was eating away at me, but I couldn't confront her without more proof. I needed something solid. Then came Friday night. Sarah was getting ready for another girls' night with Kayla. She mentioned they'd be going to a new bar they wanted to try, and I offered, casually, to drop her off. I thought maybe I could get a better sense of where she was really headed, but she quickly declined, smiling and saying, "I'll just drive myself." Thanks though. That smile again, too practiced, too smooth. After she left, I sat there, my mind buzzing. I tried to calm myself, to tell myself that I was just imagining things. But the longer I sat, the more I realized I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, deciding to follow her. I kept my distance as she drove, taking turns carefully, trying to stay out of her sight. We reached the downtown area, and I assumed she was heading to a bar like she said. But then she turned onto a side street and pulled into the parking lot of a restaurant. A nice place. The kind of place we used to go to on date nights. I parked a few spaces down, watching as she got out, looking around as if checking to see if anyone had followed her. I slumped down in my seat, my heart pounding as I saw her walk toward the entrance with a sense of purpose that chilled me. Was she meeting someone here? After a few minutes, I decided to go inside. I kept my head down, trying to stay out of sight as I made my way into the dimly lit restaurant. And that was when I saw her. Sarah was sitting in a booth near the back, and across from her was a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, leaning forward with a relaxed smile. The two of them were deep in conversation, and I watched as she laughed at something he said, her hand reaching across the table to brush his. They looked comfortable, familiar. A cold shock ran through me, freezing me to the spot. My worst fears had just been confirmed. She wasn't just curious about an open marriage. She was already acting on it. I backed out of the restaurant before they could see me, my mind reeling. The betrayal hit me hard, like a physical blow. All the little signs, all the doubts that had been eating at me were now crystal clear. She had been seeing this guy behind my back, planning this whole thing while pretending we were fine. I sat in my car, numb, watching through the restaurant window as they talked, laughed, shared what looked like an intimate meal. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. The woman I'd spent over a decade with, the woman I trusted with everything, had been lying to me, sneaking around, and hiding a relationship that went beyond anything I could have imagined. After what felt like an eternity, they stood up, and Sarah gave him a lingering hug before heading back to her car. She didn't see me as she left. I waited until she was gone, staring at her empty seat, my mind blank with shock. The drive home was a blur. Every part of me felt numb, yet my chest was tight with a mix of rage and heartbreak. I trusted her, believed in our marriage, and here she was, meeting another man in secret. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I got home, I sat in the dark, replaying everything I'd seen. All the signs were there, every clue I'd brushed off because I didn't want to believe it. But the truth was staring me in the face now. This wasn't just a harmless conversation or a fleeting idea. Sarah was involved with someone else, and she'd used the open marriage talk to cover her tracks. I knew I had to confront her, but I wasn't sure how. Part of me wanted to wait until I had calmed down, to approach it rationally. But the other part of me wanted to scream, to let her know just how much she had hurt me. I couldn't decide which one would win out. When she came home later that night, she looked tired but content, like she'd just spent an ordinary evening with friends. She slipped into bed beside me without a word, her breathing soft and even. I lay awake, every fiber of me tense, feeling the weight of what I knew. As I listened to her drift off to sleep, I realized the woman I loved was gone. Or maybe she'd never been who I thought she was. Either way, everything was different now, and there was no going back. The next morning, I couldn't look at her the same way. Every word she said felt like a lie, every smile like a mask. She chatted over breakfast, casual as always, talking about plans for the day, but all I could hear were her laughs from last night, her hand reaching out to touch that stranger's. I managed to keep my composure, forcing myself to nod, to murmur replies when needed, but inside, I was boiling. The memory of her with him in that restaurant kept flashing in my mind. My gut churned with anger, yet I still couldn't bring myself to confront her. I wanted her to admit it, to see if she'd try to lie one more time. But as the days passed, her calm, cheery demeanor only dug the knife deeper. Finally, after a week of tension and sleepless nights, I knew I had to act. This couldn't go on. My own house felt like a cage, and every look, every touch from her felt like an insult. I needed answers, even if I feared what she'd say. That night, I decided to bring it up. As she was rinsing off the dishes, I leaned against the counter, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah," I started, my heart pounding. "I need to know the truth about this open marriage idea. Is there already someone else?" She froze, her back to me, and I watched her shoulders tense. For a second, I thought she'd try to brush it off, maybe give me some half-baked excuse. But then, she turned around slowly, her face pale. "Jack," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's complicated. Complicated." I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "You don't just wake up one day and suggest an open marriage out of the blue. And you don't meet some guy in secret if everything's fine with us." She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw something real: guilt, shame. "I never meant for it to happen this way," she said finally, her voice breaking. I thought I could handle it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You thought you could handle lying to me? Sneaking around?" She took a step closer, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled back. "I'm so sorry, Jack," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to hurt you. I thought maybe, if we opened things up, I wouldn't have to choose." It all came crashing down then. The betrayal, the lies, the truth about the life I thought we had. There was no coming back from this, no words that could undo what she'd done. I stared at her, feeling like I was looking at a stranger. This woman, who I'd built a life with, shared every secret and every small victory with, had been lying to my face. And now, here she was, asking me to understand as if this were some small mistake. You didn't want to hurt me? I repeated, disbelief laced in my voice. How did you think this would end, Sarah? Did you think I'd just go along with it? Share you with some guy you've been sneaking off to meet? Her tears fell freely now, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. I thought if I could be honest about wanting more, we could find a way to make it work. I never stopped loving you, Jack. Loving me? The words felt bitter on my tongue. You say you love me, but every word you say now just proves how little respect you have for me, for us. All this talk about honesty. If you cared about honesty, you wouldn't have done any of this behind my back. She covered her face with her hands, her sobs muffled. But instead of pity, I felt only a cold detachment. I was done listening to excuses, done being the fool who trusted too easily. The truth was, she hadn't just betrayed our marriage. She had destroyed the trust I'd once had in her, in us. For a long time, we stood there in silence. I could feel the weight of 1,000 unsaid words hanging between us. Finally, she looked up, her face blotchy and her eyes red. I know I can't fix this, she said, her voice small. But maybe if we talk to someone, a therapist, they could help us through this. I shook my head, barely able to contain the anger simmering beneath the surface. Sarah, therapy can't fix this. Therapy doesn't rebuild the kind of trust you destroyed. I don't know if you realize how deep this goes. This isn't just a mistake. You planned this, lied about it, and then tried to drag me into your mess without even giving me a choice. She looked as though she'd been slapped, but I was past the point of caring. I felt hollow, numb, like every emotion had been drained out of me. Maybe there was a time when I'd have considered trying to salvage this, but that was before I knew just how far she'd gone. I don't know what else to say, she whispered, her voice trembling. I was confused, Jack. I was trying to figure things out, and it all just got out of control. That's not an excuse, I replied coldly. You could have talked to me. You could have been honest before it got to this point, but you chose to do it this way. And now, I don't know how I'm supposed to just move on from this. She opened her mouth, probably to defend herself again, but I raised a hand, stopping her. No more explanations, Sarah. I've heard enough. You've made it clear where your priorities lie. For a second, I saw a glimmer of defiance in her eyes, like she wanted to argue, to somehow shift the blame. But instead, she nodded, defeated. If this is what you really want, then I'll move out for a while. Give you space. I didn't respond, but in that moment, I knew the space wasn't going to fix anything. This wasn't some temporary separation that would heal with time. Sarah had broken something in me that couldn't be mended, and we both knew it. She lingered there for a moment, maybe hoping for some sign that I'd change my mind, that I'd reach out and forgive her. But I stayed silent, my heart heavy with a finality I hadn't felt before. Without another word, she turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows of the house we'd once built together. As I listened to the quiet of the empty room, I realized there was nothing left for me here. The woman I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone I couldn't recognize, and I couldn't live in a marriage built on broken promises and shattered trust. And I knew then, this was the end. The following days felt surreal, like I was moving through a fog. Sarah had left, taking only a few things with her, but the emptiness she left behind was enormous. Our home felt cold and hollow, like all the memories we'd made there were somehow tainted. Every corner, every small reminder of her only deepened the ache I felt. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that walking away was the only option left. And yet, each night, I lay awake, my mind racing with questions I'd never have answers to. How long had she been seeing him? Did she ever think about how it would affect me? How it would tear apart the life we'd built? Or was I just collateral damage in her search for something more? At work, I tried to focus, to bury myself in tasks, but the thoughts always found a way to creep in. People noticed, of course. A few of my friends asked if something was up, but I brushed it off, too exhausted to explain. I was tired of thinking about it, tired of explaining it, even to myself. The worst part was knowing I'd have to face her again. Divorce wasn't just a decision. It was a process, one that meant meetings, documents, and dividing up everything we'd once shared. The thought of sitting across from her, seeing that same face that had lied to me so easily, made me sick. Then, one afternoon, I got a message from her. "Can we talk?" It read, short and simple, but it set off a storm of emotions I tried so hard to keep buried. I didn't respond right away. I knew what she wanted, to explain, to try and salvage some piece of what we had. But I was done with explanations. She had shown me her true colors, and no amount of talking would change that. After a while, I finally replied, "There's nothing left to say, Sarah. The papers are with my lawyer. It's over." Sending that message felt like a release, a small step toward the closure I desperately needed. She might have been looking for a way to save face, but I didn't owe her that. What I owed was to myself, to start over and rebuild, without her lies hanging over me. The finality of it all hit me like a wave, but instead of drowning, I felt a strange sense of relief. I hadn't realized just how heavy the weight of this marriage had become until I began letting go. The months of suspicion, the painful confrontations, the nights spent wondering what I could have done differently, all of it faded into the background. In the weeks that followed, I began reclaiming parts of myself that had been buried under years of compromise and sacrifice. I reconnected with friends I drifted away from, took up old hobbies, and spent more time outdoors, rediscovering what made me feel alive. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding a new path forward. There were still hard days, of course. I'd catch myself scrolling through old photos or seeing reminders of our life together in places we used to frequent. But over time, the hurt softened, and I learned to make peace with the memories. They were a part of me, but they didn't define my future. I learned something crucial through it all. Love, trust, and honesty were non-negotiables. Sarah's betrayal had taught me that the foundation of any relationship had to be built on those pillars, and without them, everything crumbles. The pain I'd endured had shown me what I needed to value, not just in others but in myself. Months later, when the divorce was finalized, I felt a bittersweet satisfaction. The papers were just a formality. I'd already let go long before. As I signed the last document, I thought back to that night when Sarah first mentioned an open marriage, how it had blindsided me and set off a chain of events I could never have anticipated. But in a strange way, it was the catalyst I needed to find myself again. I walked out of the lawyer's office that day with a renewed sense of freedom. The future was uncertain, but it was finally my own, unencumbered by deceit or doubt. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope, knowing that I'd been strong enough to let go, to move forward. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I'd face it on my terms, with open eyes and an open heart. I was ready for a new beginning,